Behind the Fab Four's harmonies, was there an unseen hand shaping the thoughts and bending the minds of the listener? Something we weren't meant to fathom. Between melody and madness, freedom and control, there lies a truth perhaps too dangerous to know. Let's explore a tale of manipulation and hidden agendas here on Things Visible and Invisible. Mark Devlin is a UK-based club and radio DJ, music journalist and author. In 2010, he underwent a transformative awakening that led him to dig deeper into the hidden reality of the mainstream music industry. As an author, he's best known for his multi-volume series Musical Truth, where he investigates hidden agendas and the true nature of corporate music machines. And he joins me down the line from his home in England. Mark, welcome back to Things Visible and Invisible.
Hey Sean, good to be back with you.
There is much in your multi-volume series that we could discuss, Mark, but since your last appearance, a number of people have asked us to speak to you on the subject of the Tavistock Institute, an organisation which many people point the finger to in some of the mind-controlled experiments in the past. But I think it would be fair to say that most people scratch their head and say, Tavistock what? So if you wouldn't mind, let's begin with where this organisation, such as it is, where it started and why it started.
Yeah, so Tavistock is a word which is synonymous with mind control and propaganda, effectively, when you get into this area of research. That's what it's all about. It's an expression of the British government, if you take it back far enough, the establishment. And it had its roots in the First World War era. It was originally known as Wellington House. And this was the name for Britain's War Propaganda Bureau at the time. It was realised that Germany had an intel department which was dealing with things like mass propaganda and brainwashing and selling the idea of war to the general public. And so the British decided they needed a counterpart to head that off. And that was the origins of what would later become Tavistock. So it was known as Wellington House. It was closely linked to an organisation known as Chatham House, which was the Royal Institute of International Affairs, involved in fairly similar activities. And in its early days, Tavistock, those behind it, enlisted a bunch of prominent authors, literary giants of the time, to help get behind the idea and sell it to the public. So names included William Archer, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, John Masefield, H.G. Wells, G.M. Trevelyan, some very recognisable names there. Rudyard Kipling had apparently been invited to the initial meeting, but was unable to attend. So I think early on there, we've got an indicator that this was going to be about fiction and selling certain ideas and narratives to the general public. Why else would you want to enlist novelists to help you do that? So in its early years, it was engaged with ideas of espionage and military intelligence. But at some point, it became weaponized and it got used within the confines of popular culture and entertainment. And people think it's just that. When it comes to music and TV shows and movies and things of this nature, they think it's all about just harmless fun and entertainment. And they're very surprised to learn that there could be expressions of military intelligence involved in these institutions. But they are. And as I've mentioned before, these popular culture vehicles are the ideal way to sow value systems, beliefs, prejudices, certain ways of looking at the world into the minds of large numbers of people. When it's done under the guise of what people think is entertainment and popular culture, it's flying below the radar and it's hitting people in their collective subconscious minds. And that's where all the magic works. That's where manipulation of the human psyche can take place. And that actually is what Tavistock in its various iterations has been involved with right from the start. It's the very clever manipulation of human psychology by experts who know very well how the human psyche works and therefore how it can be shaped and molded to suit agendas which serve them. So that's what Tavistock has been involved with right from the start. It's had many different names, many different identities, but at the end of the day, the business is always the same. It's mass mind control and it's social engineering.
And has Tavistock always been closely aligned with whatever the ruling elite, ruling government is of its day?
Yeah, pretty much. It's an expression of the British establishment in the same way that the BBC is, for example. So the BBC is the state propaganda broadcasting arm. That institution puts out whatever messages serve the British establishment, the government, and the forces that control the government. And Tavistock is another arm of all of that. It specializes in psychological warfare. So psychology has been weaponized by behavioral scientists, psychologists, anthropologists, people whose full-time job it is to work out how the human mind can be manipulated.
Now, the Tavistock may have its origins in the First World War, but presumably by the Second World War, it was very much needed in terms of making sure that the general population here in Britain were very much on the side of the war.
It certainly helped to have those ideas getting pushed by experts in human psychology. Yeah, so they know how to package up a message and sell it to the general public. So if they're trying to push ideas of war and they're trying to get the public behind that, then they've got some very clever methods and tactics up their sleeve to make people believe or to get them aligned with the message. And we saw a modern rendering of this notion in the COVID era, actually, going back not too far, 5 or 6 years ago. All the propaganda that was getting used to get people on board with the message that was getting pushed in those times was coming through the very same behavioral scientists and psychologists that have been pushing all this stuff for decades. So it was all assets deployed and everyone was getting on board with the messaging that was getting put out at the time. And I'm sure most people realize there was a lot of psychological manipulation being used to sell all the ideas of the so-called pandemic during the COVID era. So all kinds of tried and tested methodology was getting rolled out on the general public. And I feel a lot of that was coming from British shores. So a lot of this methodology had been perfected by the forces that controlled Tavistock and those that worked for it in Britain, and it was getting exported around the world. Because if we take the COVID thing as a case study, exactly the same messaging was getting put out in America, all across Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, most parts of the world. You know, governments of the world were putting out identical messaging with identical timelines, and all of that had to be getting coordinated from a central source somewhere. And it's my view that that was coming out of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which is the identity by which it's most commonly known these days. And that's why we saw exactly the same messaging getting pushed out all around the world at the same time. They were using templates, they were using blueprints, and these have been tried and tested and used very successfully for many decades.
Now, the fact that governments are pushing whatever the agenda is nothing new, and we almost expect it. I think when I was growing up, there were what's known as public information films. I don't know if you remember them, Mark, which we now see as kind of government propaganda of one sort or another. And I'm sure this was the same in many European countries at the time. However, what we want to focus on today is more your research and your writing around something which, on the surface, I sort of began to scratch my head a little bit about. And let me explain what I mean by that, Mark. I get it that governments have agendas that they're pushing. I get it that they want to understand the psyche of their populations and get them to fall in line with whatever it is, whatever the agenda, left, right, whatever. However, what will come as a surprise to people, and you've alluded to it already, is that these kind of organizations are also interested in mass culture, the popular culture of the day, and specifically their interest in popular music from the late 1950s onwards. Talk to me about why, if that is the case, Tavistock would want to be interested in rock music, rock and roll, from the 1950s onwards.
They're all about the shaping and moulding of cultural attitudes. And it's been observed that a lot of people are very suspicious of government, rightfully so, and perceived establishment figures. So if somebody representing openly, overtly representing the British government or other expressions of the establishment were to come out and try and deliver messaging and try and encourage people towards adopting certain lifestyles and certain beliefs and certain perceptions, there would be a lot of suspicion and presumably a lot of pushback to that. But if all of that is coming through perceived cultural heroes, and if people have been conditioned to believe that these icons, these rock gods and such that they look up to, are just like them, they're regular, everyday folk, and they've got going in a very grassroots, organic kind of way, and they just happen to have found great success and great prominence in society, then any message that they're going to deliver is likely to get more readily accepted because the message is going to feel more genuine. It's going to feel like it's coming from somebody that they respect, they look up to, that they've decided they like. So the shaping and molding of cultural heroes becomes very important. The establishment would want to always control that narrative in terms of who gets promoted, who gets prominent, who gets exposed in society to a point where they can have that level of influence over large numbers of people. So it's my view, and it's the view of many other researchers, that when it comes to rock stars, majorly successful bands, household name A-list artists that we've all heard of, and also actors that get really big in Hollywood movies and other film industries, and TV presenters, sports stars, politicians, anyone that's in the public eye to the point that the average member of the public has heard of them and is familiar with the name, they're all going to want to have been vetted in terms of the establishment. They're going to want to have chosen who rises to those kind of positions in society. And Tavistock would have been very influential in advising the methodology that can be used to endear these sort of people to the general public. So with a lot of rock stars, they're thought of first and foremost as just that, as rock stars. And one example I always like to use, because, you know, it illustrates the point very well, is Bono from U2. So, you know, ostensibly, he's supposed to be a rock star. He's supposed to be a rock singer, you know. But in recent decades, he seems to have spent more of his time and more of his resources in delivering political messaging. He's got behind various agendas, which help to advance the New World Order master plan, when you really get down to it. So globalist agendas, we can call it, to use that term. And the reason he was selected to deliver a lot of this messaging is because by the time he started doing it, a lot of people had decided that they liked him. Not quite sure why, but, you know, he had a fan base. And so if a rock star is coming out and saying to people, you should get behind this agenda, this is a really good idea, this needs to happen in the world, people are more likely to listen to them and think, oh, well, you know, if my personal rock god hero is saying this, then it must be a good idea, than if some dusty old politician or academic or business leader comes out and says it. So it was realized a long time ago that an ingenious way of selling ideas to the public and steering culture in certain desired directions that suit the establishment's master plan is by getting that messaging delivered through manufactured heroes, through popular culture. And that's why there's long been a link between social engineering think tanks like Tavistock and others, you know, the Frankfurt School and Stanford Research Institute in the United States, which are all involved in the same sort of work, and popular culture. On the surface, there ought to be no links between these different institutions whatsoever, and yet we find them everywhere. And this is why, because it's mass mind control. And when mass mind control is delivered through popular culture, it's much more readily accepted, and so it becomes much more effectively delivered.
Now, on the last occasion we spoke, Mark, we zoned in, if you like, on the Beatles, perhaps the most prominent, certainly global music act of the 20th century. And you made a rather sort of controversial point in the sense that anybody who thought that the Beatles legend, if we can call it that, you know, four Liverpool lads who just through their musical ability took the world by storm. I think you said more or less it was a fairy tale. That was not what happened. If that's the case, how does Tavistock, in your researches, how does it sort of pick, if you like, how does it determine who is going to be a star, who is going to be a huge star? How does that process actually work in your researches?
There are various different ways that they identify the assets that they want to use. In a lot of cases, they're born into certain family bloodlines. So this has been a major part of my work over the past 15 years or so, and a major part of many other researchers' work as well. So the answer to why it is that certain people become successful and become promoted in society over and above all other competition so often simply comes down to the families that they happen to be born into. But there are other ways in. So you can demonstrate that you want the fame and the fortune enough so that these institutions will get behind you and push you. You just have to sign a contract to say that you'll do whatever is required of you, and you have to effectively degrade your morals. This is where we have things like the Epstein parties that we've heard about, the Epstein gatherings, Epstein Island and all this stuff. And also P. Diddy, you know, all these revelations that have been coming out about Sean Puff Daddy, P. Diddy Combs, and these celebrity parties that he would hold where rich and famous and influential people would attend, celebrities, and they'd get up to who knows what with who knows who, and all that stuff would get filmed, as we've come to learn. And the footage is then used as blackmail and leverage over these people to ensure that they stay in line and do whatever is asked of them and don't go off script. It's a very good way of controlling people. Then we've got other ways in, such as through the MK Ultra mind control program. So I've spoken about the Beatles, and many other researchers have as well. And we've put forward our suspicion that the Beatles would have been a product of the Tavistock Institute. So there's no way any group could have got to be so prominent and so successful as they did if they didn't have the backing of the establishment. It's just inconceivable that you can reach those levels of success and reach off your own back. And if people think it can be done, I would extend an invitation. You know, form a band, punt around a few demos, phone up a few record labels, and see if you, under your own steam, without any kind of outside influence or assistance, can rise to those lofty heights. You will find out very quickly that you can't. So I'll save you the time and the effort of even trying, because you have to be selected by the system. The system chooses you, you don't choose it. So the main rivals of the Beatles in the 1960s and beyond were, of course, the Rolling Stones. And my research has thrown up the suggestion that Mick Jagger, prior to becoming the front man of the Rolling Stones, was engaged in the MK Ultra mind control research program coming out of McGill University in Montreal, Canada. So a lot of the MK Ultra experiments in the 1950s were done in Canada by MK Ultra doctors working for the CIA out of the United States. And they did it over the border in Canada to get around any of the problems that might otherwise arise, because the CIA was very much behind these programs. And I interviewed a lady for my podcast about 4 or 5 years ago by the name of Anne Diamond, not the British TV presenter of that name, but her real name was Anne McLean, and she was known as Anne Diamond. And she says that during childhood, she was involved in MK Ultra experiment. She was, an MK Ultra test subject. And she says that she found herself in the Allen Memorial as part of McGill University in Montreal. And during her time there, she remembers a young pre-fame Mick Jagger. She claims he was known as Michael back then. So clearly he was getting programmed, according to this story, for something. He was getting groomed for future success, in other words. And then the following decade, in the early part of the 1960s, he was a student at the London School of Economics, the LSE. This is another social engineering think tank, very similar to Tavistock, operating along similar lines. And it's where, again, they're working on culture creation and how to shape and mold public perception according to culture. So, what was Mick Jagger doing studying at the LSE, which normally turns out, you know, financial analysts and accountants and people of this nature, and then he becomes the front man of a rock band? Well, it's because through the rock band, through the Rolling Stones, alongside the other members, he was helping to push culture in certain desired directions. This group were marketed as rivals to the Beatles. And what we have here is a classic method that's used within social engineering, the creation of dialectics. So they set up a system where the public is invited to choose from one thing or the other. We see this in political parties all over the world. You know, most nations have a sort of right-wing political party and a more left-wing or liberal one. And the people are asked to choose between them. There's only ever really two choices, or ultimately it's one choice, because both parties are controlled by the same source. And so in rock music in the 60s, you had fans being asked to choose between the more wholesome, clean-cut, family-friendly Beatles, as they were at least when they first started out, or the slightly more dangerous, edgy Rolling Stones. So a lot of people graduated towards the Rolling Stones because they felt that they were a bit more sort of, gritty. But ultimately, I feel the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were all having their strings pulled by the Tavistock Institute. If we look to later in that decade, the 1960s, both groups had started to promote psychedelic culture and the taking of drugs like LSD and all these changes to society. So they were both behind the same agendas getting pushed, and they weren't really rivals at all. But the public had been entrained to think of them as rivals. As far as the establishment is concerned, it doesn't really matter which group people gravitated towards because they were still being led Pied Piper-like down certain approved paths. And so the social engineering gets done either way. The culture gets changed according to the master plan either way. And these groups become nothing more than effectively puppets and pawns in the hands of these social engineers. I know that's difficult for people to hear. They don't want to accept that groups they've looked up to and personal icons that they've held in high esteem might be anything other than how they've been presented to us publicly. But this is all part of the deception, you know? It's all part of the mass mind control.
Let me ask you this, though, Mark, because I'm following your train of thought, and what's coming to mind is the perception, and it may just be a perception, that's why I'm asking it, that the Beatles and the Stones and most of the rock groups of the 1960s were part of a countercultural wave, that they were changing society, that they were upsetting the establishment. From what you're saying, this was some kind of reverse deception.
It's all part of the propaganda. It's all part of the mind games that are being foisted upon people. The establishment doesn't want genuine rebels because genuine rebels are a real threat to their master plan. But they want to present the perception that there are genuine rebels out there that are having an impact and having their voices heard. So they would rather control the dynamic by creating the rebels themselves, because the rebels are still doing the bidding of the system at the end of the day. So a big part of what was done in the 1950s when the rock and roll era got going, mid-1950s, when you had the emergence of stars like Elvis Presley and all these other early rock and roll superstars, it was the birth of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, effectively. So it was changing attitudes towards everything in society. It was being achieved through music. It was getting achieved through movies as well and TV. But it was changing attitudes to drugs, to family, to relationships, to sex. And all of that was continued in the 1960s with the counterculture thing getting pushed by all these rock groups and the arrival of all these psychedelic drugs, hallucinogens, entheogens, LSD, and these more natural compounds as well, which were all getting pushed as part of the culture of the times. Also, the embracing of Eastern mysticism, which was tied up in this whole cocktail of influences. All of that served the establishment because they wanted to foment chaos in society. They wanted discord between the generations. They wanted the young people at the time completely at odds with the value system of their parents' generation. Because a chaotic society where you've got different groups fighting each other and opposing each other is one that's much easier to control and manipulate and have their strings pulled. So it suits them to have these different groups at odds with each other as long as they're controlling the narrative every step of the way. And what better way to achieve that than by having all the agents of change effectively in their pocket? So the rock bands that were causing people to have these differing attitudes towards everything were effectively on the payroll and were assets of the system. And it's a methodology that's worked very well, clearly, demonstrably. And so they've rolled it out decade after decade. And with each new decade, the scenery might change, the backdrop might change. So in the 1970s, it was kind of punk and new wave and heavy metal and progressive rock. And then as the 80s came in, it was synth pop and, electronic forms of music. And every step of the way, you've got the fingerprints of the social engineers controlling the narrative. And again, to take things back to the COVID era that we all lived through, 2020, 21, I think that serves as a masterclass case study in how culture creation works and how these manufactured heroes work. Because how many dissenting voices can you recall from those times who had anything to say about what was going on in the world that didn't align with official government policy? Very, very few. And you had lots of supposed rebels, groups, bands, individuals that were supposed to be anti-establishment. They were supposed to be distrustful of government and royalty and all the rest of it. And they were absolutely on point with their messaging, which was totally in alignment with what the government was saying, with what all these health organizations were saying. Don't you think that if there were any genuine rebels out there who really had made it under their own steam organically, we would have heard a few more dissenting voices who disagreed with what the government was saying, who might have said, actually, this isn't quite the case, and actually, this is not the best way of going about things. But we didn't get that. We had many groups that the public had been conditioned to think of as anti-establishment, doing the establishment's messaging for it. So I think those times told us everything we need to know about how effectively culture creation and social engineering works.
You said something there quite thought-provoking, Mark, which is that the establishment doesn't want real rebels, so they kind of confect these kind of rebels that aren't really rebels at all. I'm just thinking, if we go back to the 1960s, the Cold War was very much alive at that time. Post-war, the whole sort of paranoia around the East and in the West and all the rest of it, was this something feeding into it, that rather than having a real revolution of social change, economic principally in the West, that they would play it out in these kind of culture wars or so-called counter-revolutionary type activities of your local pop star? Do you see that as being something, as a backdrop to what really was taking place in the 1960s?
Well, quite possibly. And a lot of people often come back at me when it comes to the 60s hippie movement, and they'll say, oh, you weren't old enough to be there, Mark. You know, I lived through it. There might be older people that were a part of the culture in those times. And I think what often happens is a movement will get off the ground in its very initial stages in an organic kind of way. So I accept that in the 60s, there would have been a lot of genuine pushback from members of the public towards a lot of the politics of the time. It was the Cold War era, as you say, and then you had things like the Vietnam War narrative coming through in the United States. So there would have been a lot of the young people at the time that would have been opposed to all of that, and they would presumably have started to organize themselves into certain little pockets and movements here and there. I think the social engineers employ spotters, effectively, whose job it is to keep an eye on these little areas of resistance which might grow up. And the job then is to make sure they're very quickly steered off in certain pre-approved directions. So this is where we have things like infiltrators, adjunct provocateurs that will get inserted into these groups, and they will do their very best to make sure that things go off in certain ways. And then you'll have people like, to take the 60s example, many of the prominent rock musicians of the time would have come straight out of the establishment. I think a classic example, we probably spoke about him last time, I think we did, was Jim Morrison of The Doors. And, there's endless evidence to document the fact that his father was the Navy admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag psyop, which was used to justify America's involvement in the Vietnam War. So there we've got one example of the son of military intelligence who was inserted into a position of great cultural influence. And at the time in the 60s, I'm sure many people thought that he was a genuine, folk hero. He was an icon. He was a poster child for that whole anti-war, anti-establishment generation. But we can demonstrate now where he came from, and it's not an isolated example. People often like to think that it is, but most of the rock stars that came out of the 60s scene in the United States had direct family connections into military intelligence and expressions of the government. So these people were deliberately getting inserted into the scene, and they would then have been doing their best to make sure that scene went where it was supposed to go. And then again, to treat this as a case study, by the end of the 1960s, that whole scene was effectively done for, finished. A lot of researchers feel that the so-called Tate Manson murders, which are said to have taken place in August of 1969, contributed in huge part to the idea of hippie culture, the hippie ethos, just getting completely stamped out, because a lot of people were associating hippies and their value systems with murderous maniacs like Charles Manson. And that was like the final nail in the coffin for hippie culture. So by the end of 1969, that whole way of life was starting to fizzle out and was getting replaced with new scenes and new genres and new movements. And this is what they like to do. They build something up, and then quite often they systematically destroy it and move on to the next agenda. These people do this stuff for a full-time living. Behavioral scientists working out of places like Tavistock, this is all they do, just work out how to shape and mold society and get people thinking in certain ways. And like I've said, it's an ingenious way to achieve things by doing it through entertainment and popular culture.
Well, ingenious or insidious, but we'll probably get to that. Mark, just on that point, I'm just thinking, one of the things that has run alongside rock music from the 1950s onwards is kind of subcultures. In the 50s in England, certainly you had Teddy Boys, then you had the mods and the rockers, and then across the world you had the hippie movement, and then that mutated into punks and so on and so forth. Are these groupings, movements, whatever you want to call them, are they also part of this overarching experiment?
I would say that they are. It's my view that any fad, trend, movement scene which sweeps up millions of people in its wake and affects the way that they behave, the way they think, the way they dress, the way they speak, is going to have come out of one of these culture creation think tanks, because it just defies credibility that any kind of movement would be allowed to gain that sort of influence over such large numbers of people without being endorsed and co-signed by the establishment. With the control system that we unfortunately have in this world, it expresses itself through many different means, through the political system, the political world, through the world of big business, academia, science, medicine, religion, mainstream media, and of course, popular culture and entertainment. So the architects of these agendas are clearly very clever. They're very smart. They've got their game on lock. Are we really going to believe that they're very efficient, except when it comes to entertainment and popular culture and music? And that's where they start to get sloppy, and they take their eye off the ball, and they allow these groups and these bands and these scenes and these fads to seep through when they're not necessarily serving the establishment in some way. Admittedly, it can be very difficult to identify exactly how a fad or a trend or a scene might be serving the establishment. We could think of, for example, the new romantic scene within music in the early 80s. It can be difficult to pinpoint exactly how that would have benefited the control system in any way. But I would argue that that scene quite simply would not have been allowed to have gained the momentum that it did if it didn't in some way come out of that very establishment if it wasn't an expression of the control system. And again, if people want to try this for themselves as a little experiment, try starting a new fad or a trend or a scene and see how far you get with it. If you think these things can happen organically and it's just the way it goes, see how far you get with it. See if you can reach millions of people without the endorsement of these agencies and these think tanks and these institutions that ensure that culture goes in certain desired ways and directions and stuff. And it really is all encompassing. As I said, it affects the way people speak and the way they dress. I myself fell victim to this to a very large extent in the 1990s. I was a DJ and I was out there playing rap and hip hop and R&B and other forms of black music. And there was a point where I allowed myself to get steered by the culture and the lifestyle. And I started speaking as if I was black and dressing in certain ways, which I'm not proud of now because I was very naive and very easily led. But I think if we're honest, most of us have been coerced and conditioned in that way, one way or another. It's only often later in life that we can see how we were led astray in our younger years. And that's the reason why most of these agendas are aimed at young people, because they're much more malleable, they're much easier to steer in their behaviors and their actions and such than when you get to a certain point in life, like I am now, where I'm cynical and world weary and jaded. I'm a bit more difficult to have the wool pulled over my eyes at this stage in life. But when you're young, you're rife for manipulation, wide open to be shaped and molded. And that's why these youth movements are so effective at driving the behaviors of young people. Always has been that way.
Now, you mentioned bloodlines, Mark, and you've alluded to the establishment as the prime mover in all of this. Ultimately, what is the agenda here? I mean, who's really in control of this?
Well, it's very difficult to pinpoint precise names. When it comes to the music industry, you can look at some of the moguls, some of the industry giants, people like Clive Davis, for example. He's been around for decades and he's a very dark, shady figure. But the buck wouldn't stop with him. He's going to be answering to people much higher up the chain of command. And people put names on some of these families that control things like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. And they'll have been very influential and very important. But again, it won't just be them. They'll be answering to higher ups as well. And I think the higher ups that are really pulling the strings and driving all these things are those that keep themselves out of the public spotlight of scrutiny. So the reason you don't know their names is because they don't want you to know their names. They just push a few of their lower level gophers and minions out there so you can say, oh, these are the ones, it's them that's causing it. Sean P. Diddy Combs, who has had a certain level of prominence and influence in the industry, but he's still relatively low level in the grand scheme of things. He's a prime example of somebody that they'll push out front center. And obviously he's somebody that's got a big ego and he's enjoyed the limelight and he's reveled in all of that, or he did until they seemingly turned on him a couple of years ago, and now he's in jail. So that's a little reminder that if you get into bed with psychopaths and Satanists, you should never be that surprised when they turn on you and it suits them to throw you under a bus someday. So to answer your question as to who's driving all this, ultimately it will be the same forces that utilize things like the world of politics and academia and science and medicine and all of these different things. They're going to be occultists. They're dark occultists at their core nature, which is why so much of what they do is ritualistic in nature, because they're adhering to their religious belief systems and such. And that drives a lot of the way that they do things. And so entertainment, popular culture, music is just one arm of everything that they utilize to try and instill their New World Order master plan. Ultimately, these individuals just want to control and enslave humanity. And they use all these different methods that they got at their disposal to achieve that. And they all interlink. There comes a point where it all overlaps and it correlates with each other. And you can see how the political system, for example, is working in cahoots with Hollywood movies to push certain ideas subliminally. And then music dovetails into that. And you can see that everything is ultimately connected. And it just comes down to the very big question of who or what is controlling of human society and to what end. And I wouldn't even begin to pretend that I can answer that big a question. But that's the question that hangs over us either way.
Final question, Mark. You've worked in the music industry. You're a veteran of that. How much do you think people in the music industry, at whatever level, are as conscious as you of this manipulation?
I think there's going to be many more of them than we would realize who have figured out what's going on. So when I first started doing my Musical Truth work, I put the first book out 10 years ago. Volume 1 was spring 2016, and that was the result of 5 years worth of research before that. So I've been on the path for 15 years, basically. And I remember when I first went public with the book and I started doing talks and podcasts and stuff, I thought to myself, oh, I hope I've got this right. I'm really putting my neck on the line here. You know, I'm burning a lot of bridges. If I've got all this wrong, this is really going to backfire on me. But I can honestly say in all that time, I've had nothing but validation of the points that I've been making. And this has been coming from people within the music industry. So people might say of me, I don't know what I'm talking about because I haven't worked within the belly of the beast. But these people have. I've been contacted by high-level musicians, names that you would have heard of. I won't give the names here because I don't want to expose them when they might not wish to be exposed. But, you know, some very high-ranking names. And also producers, record industry executives, people very high up in the business who know what they're talking about. And they tell me they've seen a lot of this stuff. They've seen a lot of the dark occult rituals which take place, which musicians are coerced into taking part in. They've seen a lot of the agenda pushing that goes on. They've seen documentation to show that rock groups are being used to push certain things. So there's going to be many more than we know about who are clued up with all this stuff. But it's not difficult to see why these people would not want to go public and stick their head above the parapet and you know, go on record with what they know. This is something I get often. Oh, Mark, if what you say is true, how come all these big name rock stars aren't speaking out? Well, a few of them have spoken out about the way that the industry operates, the nature of the contracts that record labels hold their artists in. Prince spoke out about that. Michael Jackson spoke out about that. George Michael spoke out about that. There's something that links those three artists. Can anyone think what it is? Oh, yes, they all died young. And then back in the 60s, you had Sam Cooke and Otis Redding that were trying to go up against the industry, and both of them just happened to die shortly afterwards. So there's a reminder, a very visible reminder to any other artists who might have been thinking of speaking out and going public with stuff that they've seen of what can happen to you if you choose to do that. So when you consider it in that way, it's not difficult to see why many of them would stay silent, but they would be sitting on this knowledge. And it's probably eating away at their conscience, and they dearly love to be putting it out there, but they realize how massive the consequences could be to them if they did go public and speak out. So that's why we don't get the household names coming out with all this stuff. But it's not to say they don't see it and they don't know about it. Many of them have contacted me privately and said that they do. And yeah, I'm sure there are many of them just grappling their consciences day and night and getting bothered by all this stuff, but they can't speak out. They just can't.
Fascinating. Mark, for now, tell people where they can find out more about you, your various researches, and also pick up a copy of one of your many books.
Sure. So the 4 books in my Musical Truth series are all available on Amazon. If you want to get a signed copy from me personally, if you're in the UK and most parts of Europe, I can mail them out. But if you're elsewhere in the United States or elsewhere in the world, I honestly recommend getting them from Amazon. It's just cheaper. It's less hassle. When I try and send the books overseas, they usually get seized and there's customs charges and all sorts. So you can get those on Amazon. And for everything else, I've got a YouTube channel. I've got a Rumble, Odyssey. I do loads of podcasts. I do public talks on all this stuff. And you can get information on all of that at djmarkdevlin.com. That's my main hub website.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
No worries, mate. Cheers.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.